And you are with The World on ABC News. Let's get to our top international stories today. And there are fears India's deadly second wave of coronavirus is nowhere near its peak. The past 24 hours has been the deadliest for the country since the pandemic began, as more than 3,600 people lost their lives. And there's been nearly 370,000 new cases reported now. Despite the tragic statistics, the country is still pushing ahead with state elections. These are the latest pictures from Bolpur, where voters are casting their ballots in the West Bengal election. You can see here that people are wearing masks, but the long queues mean there is little in the way of social distancing, raising concerns about these acting as super spreader events. Meantime, India's Foreign Secretary says there's been an outpouring of support from the international community.
The night of 27th April from the UK, which brought in a number of oxygen concentrators, ventilators and other equipment. Last night we had a flight from Russia, actually 2 aircraft, special aircraft that came in from Russia that brought very large number of oxygen generating equipment. You would have seen the details of that assistance also from the United States. And of course, that assistance also went into areas like raw materials for our vaccine industry, etc. But the US is going to provide, at an initial basis, at least 3 of these aircraft coming in with much needed oxygen equipment and concentrators, other areas that we need assistance.
At least 18 million people in India have contracted COVID-19, and as we reported yesterday, the death toll has now exceeded 200,000. As staggering as those figures seem, experts say they are vastly underestimated, and authorities are being accused of trying to shut down criticism of the nation's response. Our South Asia correspondent James Ocean is in Delhi.
Harshid Kathar's grandmother is in hospital with COVID-19.
If we don't give oxygen, she will die in hospital. Hospital say no oxygen.
He's willing to make the hour-and-a-half journey to deliver it himself.
It is very far and no one is allowed to go inside.
Confidence in India's frail healthcare system has been shattered as the country drowns in the virus.
You don't even get to see the body of your loved ones, and sometimes bodies are switched.
Residents are being forced to fend for themselves. Many scramble to secure oxygen from volunteer groups and buy it from the black market, where it can sell for exorbitant prices.
We came here around 5 this morning, but there were others who've been here since midnight.
Hundreds of people are coming here each day. If we had help from the government, we could do so much more.
Out in the slums, hygiene is poor and social distancing is simply not an option.
This is the shanty where 7 of us live. There's less than 30 centimetres distance between us.
There's no escape from an outbreak here.
I've stopped watching the news out of fear. I'm so scared. I feel I'll die after watching.
Despite the obvious calamity here in India, there's concerned efforts are being made to suppress the true story. Facebook and Twitter have complied with directives to take down posts critical of the government and Prime Minister. In Gujarat, deaths in major city hospitals far outnumber the official death toll, raising alarm about under-reporting. And in Uttar Pradesh, the Chief Minister has not only repeatedly denied a shortage of oxygen, but threatened legal action against people who make such claims.
There is a trust deficit, a huge trust deficit between the people and the government. The system has collapsed.
There is gross underreporting. It's happening in almost all states of India.
International medical aid is now trickling in and more lockdowns are being hastily imposed. The scramble for solutions is only just beginning. James Oaten, ABC News, Delhi.
Well, India is in a race against time to vaccinate its huge population. The government has decided not to export vaccines overseas, which means some poorer nations won't get the shots they were relying on. Michael Slezak with the story.
As people farewell the dead, authorities are struggling to protect the living. A nationwide vaccination drive is faring poorly. The government website crashed just minutes after taking registrations, and vaccine centres are running low.
They are telling us that injections are not available as vaccines have not arrived.
But India's vaccine shortage is now a global problem. The country makes more vaccines than the rest of the world combined. AstraZeneca was relying on one factory in India to produce a third of its global supply. Much of that was earmarked for developing countries. Now, with India keeping those doses for itself, many countries will miss out.
The decision to go exclusive with the Serum Institute of India and not provide the license to more manufacturers has proved deadly for the developing world.
World leaders are coming to India's aid. The US sending 60 million doses of AstraZeneca and then some.
We are sending the actual mechanical parts that are needed for the machinery they have to build a vaccine.
Australia is sending ventilators and protective equipment. Some say that's not enough.
We really need to expand the number of manufacturers.
A group of health experts want the government to act. They want trade rules waived during the pandemic so manufacturers can make generic vaccines.
We need enough vaccines for 7.8 billion people, and we can't rely on a small number of pharmaceutical companies.
The Australian government has said it's working with the World Trade Organisation on the issue. Michael Slezak, ABC News.
Taiwan's foreign minister has said that China seems to be preparing a final military assault against the country. Foreign Minister Joseph Wu cited an increase in what he called aggressive activities against the self-governing island. He also said that Taiwan will defend itself until the very end against China, which sees Taiwan as its own territory.
Disinformation campaign, hybrid warfare, and recently they have increased their gray zone activities against Taiwan. And all these seem to be preparing for their final military assault against Taiwan.
Indonesia's government has promised to build houses for relatives of the crew members aboard the submarine which sank last week. The president said this would be according to the mother's wishes and that their children's education would be funded. Joko Widodo met with the families of the 53 crew members who died when the vessel broke in waters near the island of Bali. The wreckage lies on the ocean floor at a depth of more than 800 metres, with the cause of the sinking still unknown. Well, in the UK, a new study has found that the chances of becoming infected by COVID fell sharply after a first dose of either the AstraZeneca or Pfizer vaccines, which is good news for more than 33 million people who've received at least one dose of a vaccine, and that is half the population. Associate Professor in the School of Pharmacy at the University of Reading, Dr. Alexander Edwards, joins us now. Al, good to talk to you. How significant are these findings?
So we're getting, a steady flow of good information and encouraging information. The very latest observational study is really interesting because it doesn't look at whether you're likely to get infected if you have the vaccine, but instead, if you've been vaccinated and you do get infected, the question is, are you less likely to pass it on to somebody else? And so the evidence, there's only a small amount of data because, of course, it's early days, but the evidence suggests that you're actually half as likely to pass the virus on if you do get infected. So this tells us two things. One thing is it does remind us, just because you've had the vaccine, they're very effective vaccines, but you can still get infected. So that's something we should all bear in mind. But the really exciting news is that if you're less likely to infect somebody else in your household once you've been vaccinated, that is very encouraging because that means that we will just get much less spread of the virus.
Yeah. So the point, though, is to still go ahead with the 2 doses of the vaccines, because at that point they're far more effective at even contracting the virus.
So that's really important. So because it's early days still, we don't have that much data. These are early days after the vaccine, and this study was really interesting because it showed that it takes at least 2 weeks before you get protection, which is what we expected. But the reason for having 2 doses, as you say, you want to boost that immune response, get it as strong as possible, which minimizes the chance of infection. But we mustn't also forget that the other reason for having 2 doses is it's likely to give you a much longer protection, so that you're protected into the future years, rather than maybe a single dose may actually fade after several months.
Indeed. The notion of the different variants, though, are these taken into account, or is at this point just the UK variant at the moment?
So that study would almost certainly, most of those cases would be for the dominant UK variant, which is the one which emerged just before Christmas and spread very rapidly, causing havoc. So we don't think that that's likely to reduce the effectiveness of the vaccines, that particular strain, whereas there are other strains which are slightly different in terms of the target of the antibodies, and we might expect vaccines to be slightly less effective against those other strains. At the moment, we don't have a huge amount of data. We're pretty confident that the vaccines still give you a massive benefit. It's just that if you have, say, 80 or 90% protection against the old strain and the new strain, maybe you drop 10 or 20%. So it will still be tremendously beneficial to have the vaccine. Which is so encouraging really for the whole globe. Now, the government has also introduced a mass testing system. What are they hoping to achieve with that? So there's a very strong motivation for mass testing, which is that often by the time somebody develops symptoms, they've got a cough, they've got a fever, they're starting to feel ill. Actually, the reality is they've been infected for several days. And during those several days, they've been going around their everyday life and potentially infecting other people. So the idea of a asymptomatic mass screening scheme is to try and identify people before they become symptomatic, before they notice. Because if you don't notice you're ill and then don't get tested, then you can't isolate and prevent transmission. So that's the idea. It's a really compelling idea. So we all have these kits. We can take them home. You can stick one of these sticks up your nose, waggle it around a bit, and process it with one of these tests. And only 30 minutes later, you'll get a result, which sounds absolutely brilliant. There is some uncertainty still, and there is some controversy, because what we don't know is how effective the mass testing program is at slowing down transmission. That may seem kind of counterintuitive, but actually it's much harder than it thinks. Just because the test works quite well doesn't mean that it will be effective. So we're still waiting to see on that one. So in a way, if people are testing and it's negative, they can be quite complacent, even though you're not 100% sure how effective it is. So this is the problem, that the test itself works reasonably well. It's not as good as a lab test. That's what you would expect. It's cheaper, it's faster, but it works reasonably well. The problem is that, as with everything in these things, that humans are humans and people behave in different ways. And it's very hard to predict whether people will use these as part of their everyday life but remain cautious, or they will do a test and say, well, I'm fine, I'm going to go off and do whatever I like, not realizing that if you are infected, it's still possible to get a negative result because the tests don't pick up every single case. And also, if I'm negative today, I might be infectious tomorrow. So, we don't know whether people become complacent. We don't know how people will behave. And that's why it's hard to tell that this testing scheme is actually having a benefit. Yeah, and how many tests are you receiving, and how often are you expected to test? So I think that it's sort of rolled out slowly over the past few months. Initially, it was mainly people, either school children or families who have children at school. Now I think anybody can get these boxes of tests quite easily. And the idea is that if you test twice a week, then that's a reasonable frequency. But there's all sorts of challenges and complexities, not least the fact that originally these tests were actually designed and manufactured to detect coronavirus in somebody with symptoms. So we're kind of repurposing them, and we still don't know what effect that's going to have, changing the purpose of the test. Yeah, fascinating stuff. Good to talk, Al. Thanks for joining us. Thank you. All right, let's return to our developing story. And Western Australian Premier Mark McGowan has announced a further easing of coronavirus restrictions after that snap 3-day lockdown in the Perth and Peel regions. Now, the new rules are going to apply from Saturday, May the 1st. Most businesses and venues can return to the capacity they had before lockdown, except for nightclubs, which must maintain the 4 square metre rule. Gyms and fitness centres will be allowed to reopen. Private gatherings at homes will be limited to 30 people, up from 20. Now, Perth's major stadiums will be able to operate at 75% capacity, but caution does remain for a further week beyond this Saturday. Masks will remain mandatory indoors and on public transport and outdoors where physical distancing is not possible. Well, the operators of Brisbane's International Airport say 2 passengers who arrived from Papua New Guinea were accidentally allowed into the green zone departures area this morning. They were there for about 90 minutes, where they went to a shop, the toilets and a seating area between
5 to 10 this morning and 20 past 11 this morning. Now, during that time, about 390 passengers on 3 separate flights bound for New Zealand also transited through the area. The airport says that at this stage, it's believed only a handful of passengers were in the vicinity of the 2 red passengers at the time. They say a thorough investigation has been undertaken and have unreservedly apologised for the human error. Joe Biden has called it a once-in-a-generation investment in America, pitching his $5 trillion spending plan to rebuild the economy. On the eve of 100 days in office, the US president implored Congress to pass his proposal for jobs, which would be funded by tax hikes on the rich. From Washington, here's Greg Jennett.
No president's ever been so flanked by female power in the most prized seats in the House.
And it's about time.
Then vacant seats were abundant for the safety of the men and women of Congress in a nation weakened by pandemic.
America is on the move again.
In the almost 100 days in his job, more than 1 million Americans have got theirs back, but at least another 8 million still haven't.
Jobs. Jobs. Jobs.
To get the largest federally led job scheme in 70 years, he first has to get through the senators in front of him via the voters who put them there.
The American Jobs Plan is a blue-collar blueprint to build America.
It's a pitch aimed squarely at middle America, but there is a catch: tax increases for the wealthiest 1%.
I believe what I propose is fair, fiscally responsible.
Bold, not bombastic, ambitious but not abrasive. Joe Biden's leading an administration without the drama and the leaks of the last one. It's paying off on the pandemic, but progress towards his social goals of equality is almost unmeasurable. And his economic plans, an enormous experiment in government-led salvation. Still, the president does have time on his side. 1,361 days remaining. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Washington.
A plan to sell a stake in the All Blacks has cleared another hurdle today. The proposed $360 million Australian deal to sell 12% of New Zealand's national rugby team was approved unanimously by the 26 provincial unions, but it still faces other challenges. As Zoe George, senior sports reporter with Stuffco.nz, explained.
Just like so many other sports organisations around the world, New Zealand rugby has been impacted by COVID, and today we found out the extent of that. So they had a $34 million loss. 18 million of that was the operating budget. So they needed to go out and get some capital. Now, this whole thing with Silver Lake has been in discussion for the last 6 to 9 months, and today it was unanimously voted on by the 26 provincial unions. They want it to go ahead, but there's still one big hurdle to jump before it can actually be signed off.
And Zoe, what is that hurdle?
Well, there's a bit of opposition, mainly from the New Zealand Rugby Players Association. They have to get clearance, give clearance before this gets signed off. Now, they have been in collective bargaining and mediation with New Zealand Rugby now 4 weeks, and they've said that they will not come back to the table for at least a few weeks. They've got to get together with the players, talk about what they want, their concerns, before they come back to the table with New Zealand Rugby. But New Zealand Rugby said that they want to negotiate with them fairly. They do want to understand where the players are coming from and listen to their concerns. And so it's still going to be a few weeks yet. But the main concerns for the players are primarily looking after our paonga, our most important elements of the game. So not only our All Blacks, but also our things like the haka and the All Blacks jersey. They're afraid under this agreement that we are going to lose the ownership of that, or our Māori culture will be misappropriated. So that's one of the major concerns. Another concern has been whether or not Silver Lake will be able to dictate how many games the All Blacks play on the international stage. New Zealand Rugby have said that that's not the case, and they will continue to put that into play.
So if New Zealand Rugby is in such trouble, why is it financially attractive to an investor, and what part of the game are they actually selling?
Well, so they're selling the commercial entity of it. They're looking at international broadcast rights, merchandising, ticketing. It's the commercial aspect of it. I mean, if you're a New Zealander, you know how much the All Blacks and rugby means to our culture and to New Zealand. I mean, you're kind of born with a rugby ball.
It's absolutely everything, isn't it?
But we're talking about, you know, $387 million here. That's the equivalent of about 360 million Australian dollars. That's only 12.5% share. And what New Zealand Rugby proposes to do with that money is to filter it down through to the provincial unions and also help the growth of the youth game, Māori and Pacifica engagement, and the women's game. They would like to see either a semi-professional or professional women's league out of this.
And talking of women, New Zealand Rugby is still having difficulties meeting some of the criteria with regard to proper female representation. You were the only woman at the press conference, so I guess you know what that feels like. Why are they still struggling to meet those targets?
That's a really good question. So back a few years ago, the New Zealand government introduced the Women and Girls in Sport strategy to try and engage more women and girls in sport in New Zealand. And with that strategy, every sports body that received more than $50,000 in government funding must have a quota, reach a quota of 40% females on their board by the end of the year. Well, today, New Zealand Rugby remain at 2, which is approximately 28%, which for me is slightly concerning, considering that the vast majority of the other sports bodies have been able to either get to the 40% or exceed that 40%. Now, they actually risk losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in government funding by not reaching that. So it will be fascinating to see whether or not the government will enforce it. On the flip side, New Zealand Rugby are making moves to ensure that they have equality, 50-50 gender split on their provincial boards in the coming years, and hopefully we'll see more women feed up through that system.
Zoe, talking of the government, why did New Zealand Rugby not approach the government? It's your national game after all. Why did the government not potentially come to the rescue?
Well, actually, they already have. The government gave New Zealand Rugby approximately $5-6 million in our wage subsidy. So any business in New Zealand was able to apply for that. And several, actually most of our sports bodies did apply for that. And we're talking about millions of dollars. In fact, New Zealand Rugby were the biggest benefactors of that wage subsidy. So they have already had a bit of a handout from the government. I'm really fascinated to hear more discussions around, you know, what it might look like to have New Zealand Rugby on the New Zealand Stock Exchange. But for now, it looks like the private equity will be the way to go. Now, also, this is not the first time that Silver Lake have invested in a sports organisation. They have a share in Man City and actually in Melbourne City, A-League team, and in the UFC. So sport is not new to them. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next few weeks, particularly with the players. And, you know, I think New Zealanders are slightly worried about giving up a piece of the All Black pie.
Yeah, you can't blame them really at all. Good to talk, Zoe. Thanks so much.
Go well.
Well, to what in the world? And when an 800-kilogram bull was stranded on a Spanish beach, emergency workers found the only way to rescue him was up. After wandering away from his paddock, Bolero the bull fell around 100 metres down a cliff onto a beach in the south of the country. The fire brigade was initially called in to help the bull that sustained minor injuries, but attempts to hoist him up were unsuccessful because he was pretty heavy and big. Emergency workers, as you can then see, used a helicopter to rescue Bolero, taking him on a once-in-a-lifetime flight back to his farm. And there he is, very happily, just chilling out, grazing in his usual pasture. Tonight's top stories on the world. WA Premier Mark McGowan has announced a further easing of restrictions after the snap 3-day lockdown in Perth and Peel. India pushes ahead with state elections despite recording its deadliest day of the pandemic. And Taipei says Beijing seems to be preparing for a final military assault against Taiwan. Now, for Behind the Wall, here's Stan Grant.